Breaking tonight, the most unsettling development in the Nancy Guthrie case is not a new suspect, not a dramatic arrest, and not even the latest ransom note.
Breaking tonight, the most unsettling development in the Nancy Guthrie case is not a new suspect, not a dramatic arrest, and not even the latest ransom note. It is the growing possibility that the story the public was first given may not be the full story at all. Because 66 days into this case, investigators are still holding a vehicle tied to Nancy's son-in-law as evidence, even after family members were publicly cleared. And when you place that beside the failed ransom trail, the missing proof of life, and the timing inside Nancy's home that night, one question becomes very hard to ignore. Was Nancy Guthrie ever truly kidnapped in the way people first believed? Or did something else happen that was later made to look like a kidnapping? Here is what we know. Yeah, and it helps to slow this down because this case is easy to lose in the headlines. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie of NBC's Today Show. On the evening of January 31st, Nancy spent time with family in Tucson, Arizona. Later that night, she returned to her home in the Catalina foothills. By the next morning, she was gone. Authorities have said they believe she was abducted. And from the beginning, the case carried all the signs of a terrifying stranger crime. There was surveillance trouble at the home. There was blood. There was a masked figure. And then there were messages demanding money. That is the version the public heard first, and for understandable reasons, that version settled in quickly. But that was only the beginning, because the more details that came out, the less tidy this case looked. Yup, we learned that Nancy did not simply vanish into the night without a trace. Her family later described a scene that was deeply troubling. Savannah Guthrie said her mother was missing without her essentials, and that the condition of the home raised immediate alarm. Authorities also confirmed that blood found at the front area of the property belonged to Nancy. So from the start, this was not just a missing person case. Something happened at that house, something serious enough to leave physical evidence behind. Before we get to the car, we need to look at the timeline, because the timeline is where this case starts to narrow. Nancy was last known to be home late on January 31st. In the early hours of February 1st, key technology connected to her house and health reportedly went silent. The doorbell camera was disrupted. Her pacemaker app lost connection later that same night. That sequence matters because it suggests a fairly tight window. Whatever happened fast enough to knock out Nancy's normal pattern of life before morning. Then, later that day, after she failed to appear as expected, the alarm was raised and the search began. Now let's go back to the public theory. A kidnapping for ransom has a certain logic to it. The person takes the victim alive. They want leverage. They want communication. They want fear, yes, but they also want a path to money. That usually means direct contact, proof of life, instructions, pressure, and a practical way for the family to respond. In this case, that picture has always been uneven. Ransom messages were sent, but the whole communication trail has been clouded by uncertainty, skepticism, and what appears to be a mix of messages that may not all have come from the same source. Even now, new notes sent to TMZ are being treated cautiously, and law enforcement has not publicly embraced them as proof that Nancy was alive after the night she disappeared. That is where this gets interesting. Because if you strip away the loudest headlines and just look at the bones of the case, there are two separate questions. The first is whether Nancy was taken by force. The evidence at the house suggests that may well be true. The second question is whether she was taken alive as part of an ongoing kidnapping plot. That is a different claim, and one that gets harder to hold on to when the proof of life trail remains so thin and the ransom communications remain so unstable. By early April, the latest messages being publicized included one claim that Nancy was no longer alive and another claim that she had been seen in Sonora, Mexico. Those messages were passed to the FBI, but public reporting has made clear that investigators remain cautious about treating them as genuine. And now we come to the detail that has put fresh pressure on the case. The son-in-law's car. Nancy was last seen after spending the evening with family, including her daughter Annie and Annie's husband. Public reporting in the investigation indicated that family members were cleared, at least publicly, of involvement. But that did not end questions. Reports circulated that a vehicle connected to Nancy's son-in-law remained in evidence, Yeah, and local discussion around the case has kept that issue alive because people naturally ask the same thing. If the family was cleared, why is that vehicle still being held? The most careful answer is that investigators may still believe it could contain something useful, whether physical evidence, digital evidence, or timeline information. Holding a car does not prove guilt, but it does prove the investigation is not done with that piece of the story. That matters more than people realize. Because when investigators keep an object in evidence this long, it usually means they think it still has value. Maybe they are checking movement. Maybe they are preserving trace material. Maybe they are comparing it against other evidence that the public has not seen. The exact details are unclear. Yeah, but the broad point is simple. This case is not settled into one neat theory behind the scenes, even if the public conversation often tries to force it into one. What happened next matters because it changed the emotional tone of the whole case. On April 6th, Savannah Guthrie returned to the Today Show after weeks away. That return should have felt like a step toward normal life, but instead, it underscored how unresolved this case still is. Her mother was still missing. The family was still living with uncertainty. And right around that same moment, the latest note cycle pushed the story in an even darker direction, with claims that Nancy might not be alive. That combination hit hard because it exposed the gap between the public hope of a rescue and the private fear that the truth may be much worse. So where does that leave us on day 66? It leaves us with a case that may still involve an abduction, but not necessarily the kind of kidnapping people imagine when they hear the word. It leaves us with a house where blood was found, a night where technology went dark in a narrow window, ransom messages that have produced confusion instead of leverage, and a son-in-law's vehicle that reportedly remained part of the evidence picture long after the first wave of headlines. None of that tells us exactly what happened to Nancy Guthrie. But it does tell us the simple version of this case may not survive close scrutiny. And once you accept that, the next question becomes unavoidable. If this was not a straightforward kidnapping for ransom, then what was the real plan that night? And at what point did it go wrong? If there is one point where this case begins to shift under your feet, it is here. The public was told a story that sounded familiar. An elderly woman disappears, a masked figure appears on camera, blood is found outside the home, then ransom demands arrive. On the surface, that sounds like a kidnapping case moving along a grim but recognizable path. But when investigators and former law enforcement officials started looking more closely, the shape of that story began to change. Not all at once, quietly, piece by piece. And by day 66, one of the strongest points of pressure was no longer just what happened outside Nancy Guthrie's house. It was whether the evidence actually supports an ongoing kidnapping at all. Before we go further, let's stay with the evidence we can hold on to. The blood at Nancy's home was not rumor. The authorities confirmed that blood found on the front porch area belonged to Nancy. That matters because it fixes violence to a location. It tells us that whatever happened was not only about a disappearance, there was a physical event at the house itself. Public reporting has also described surveillance showing a masked person near the property in the early hours before Nancy was discovered missing. So we are not dealing with pure speculation or a case built only on suspicious circumstances. There was blood, there was intrusion, there was a missing 84-year-old woman. Those are hard facts, but that is also where the central contradiction begins. Because blood supports force, it supports injury. It supports that something went wrong. What it does not automatically support is a functioning ransom kidnapping in which the victim is kept alive, moved, hidden, and used for leverage over time. That second part requires something more. It requires communication that makes operational sense. It requires proof of life, or at the very least some private detail that only a genuine captor could provide in a convincing way. And 66 days into this case, that part still looks shaky. Some of the messages tied to the case have gone to the media rather than directly to the family. That alone has unsettled many observers. Because if money is truly the goal, the family is where the pressure belongs. Instead, the case has seen a strange trail of public-facing communication, including messages sent to TMZ. The newest round reportedly included claims that Nancy had been seen in Sonora, Mexico, and also that she was no longer alive. TMZ turned that information over to the FBI, but law enforcement has not publicly endorsed those claims as genuine. That leaves the messages in a troubling category. They are attention-grabbing, but they are not the same as a clean, credible ransom channel. That is where this gets heavier. Because the longer a case goes on without reliable proof of life, the more every early assumption gets tested. Families hope, investigators keep working, but time has a way of pressing on weak points. And in this case, one of those weak points is the logic of the ransom story itself. A real kidnapping for money usually creates a controlled line of pressure. The captor wants to direct fear and extract something from it. Here, the message trail has often felt scattered, public, and uncertain. That does not prove the messages are false, but it does mean the usual logic is missing. Now let's bring in the expert layer, because that is where a lot of people started quietly changing the way they spoke about this case. Former FBI agent and CIA officer Tracy Walder told News Nation she did not believe this looked like a burglary gone wrong. She said the case appeared targeted. That is an important distinction. A burglary gone wrong is one thing. A targeted crime is another. A targeted crime suggests purpose before the suspect ever reaches the house. And if the house was selected deliberately, that opens a very different line of thinking. Not random opportunity, not a panicked thief, a chosen victim, or perhaps a chosen family. What Walder said next drew even more attention. She suggested that if the targeting was real, then investigators would have to consider whether someone was trying to hurt Savannah Guthrie by going after her mother. That is painful to hear, and it remains only one theory among several. But it matters because it frames Nancy's disappearance not as a standalone money crime, but as something with a personal motive behind it. Something aimed at impact, not just profit. And then came the analysis from John Miller at CNN, which pushed the conversation another step. Miller, a former senior FBI and NYPD official, wrote that there was always the possibility this began as a planned home invasion that went completely sideways and was later re-engineered into a kidnap for ransom case because the suspect's opportunities had shifted. That is a remarkable sentence. And it stayed with many people because it puts words to something others had only hinted at. Not that the crime did not happen, not that Nancy was not taken, but that the explanation offered afterward may have been improvised to fit what the suspect needed after the original plan failed. Let me show you why that matters. If a suspect planned one kind of crime and then the situation changed fast, the signs afterward would not look smooth. They would look uneven. They would look patched together. There might be blood where there should not have been blood. There might be messages that feel more theatrical than practical. There might be desperate attempts to point investigators in one direction, while the real story sits somewhere else. Again, that is not proof. But it is a framework, and it fits some of the details the public has struggled with from the beginning. Then there is the son-in-law's vehicle. This detail has stayed alive because it resists easy explanation. Family members were publicly cleared, according to reporting, but the vehicle linked to Nancy's son-in-law reportedly remained in evidence. That could mean many things. It could be as ordinary as waiting on lab work, digital extraction, or chain of custody procedures. It could reflect pure caution. But in a case already filled with public confusion, it also signals that investigators were not prepared to close off every avenue that touched Nancy's final known family contact. That does not accuse anyone. It does something else. It keeps the timeline open. And remember the timeline here. Nancy spent the evening with family. She returned home. Overnight, the house's normal order was broken. Blood was found. Critical devices went dark. By morning, she was gone. When a case is that tight, investigators do not just look outward. They look around the final known circle, the final movements, the final vehicle, the final handoff, the final quiet stretch before the crime becomes visible to the world. That is standard investigative work. But in this case, because the public story moved so quickly toward kidnapping, every sign that investigators are still testing the close-in timeline feels especially significant. What happened next matters because it raised the emotional stakes again. Savannah Guthrie's return to the Today Show on April 6th brought the family's pain back into full public view. She returned to work while her mother remained missing, and while the newest messages in the case were suggesting darker possibilities. There is something very hard about that image. A daughter sitting under studio lights, trying to resume public life while privately living inside uncertainty. For viewers following this case, it made the whole thing feel less abstract and more urgent. Not because it offered answers, but because it reminded everyone that there still are none. So by the end of part 2, this is where the case stands. The evidence still supports that something violent happened to Nancy Guthrie at her home. The evidence still supports that she was taken or removed from that scene. But the classic kidnapping for ransom picture has grown weaker, not stronger, with time. The message trail is unstable. Proof of life has not publicly emerged. Experts have openly discussed the possibility that the original crime changed shape after it began. And investigators, by all appearances, are still treating parts of Nancy's immediate family timeline as important enough to preserve in evidence. And once you see all of that together, one question starts to eclipse every other one. If the kidnapping story was a cover for what really happened, then who needed that cover story most? By the time a case reaches day 66, something changes. The first wave of fear has already passed. The dramatic headlines have already been written. The public has already formed a picture in its mind. And what remains, if the case is still unsolved, is the slower and often harder work of deciding which parts of that picture still hold up. Yes, that is where the Nancy Guthrie case stands now. The public story began with abduction, and law enforcement has continued to describe it that way. Reuters' chronology still frames Nancy's disappearance as an abduction case, built around the masked figure caught tampering with the camera, the loss of pacemaker connectivity, the blood at the home, and the ransom-related communications that followed. No arrest has been made, and Nancy has still not been found. But the closer you look, the more the clean ransom narrative starts to give way to something rougher. Here is the part that matters most in this final chapter. Two things can be true at the same time. Nancy Guthrie may well have been taken from her home by force. The evidence supports that possibility. But that does not automatically mean the central purpose was a live hostage negotiation that stayed intact after the crime began. That second idea has become harder to sustain as the weeks have gone on, because the public has still not seen reliable proof of life and the communication trail has remained inconsistent, public-facing, and uncertain. TMZ received more notes in early April, including claims that Nancy was dead and that she had been seen in Sonora, Mexico. But those claims were handed to the FBI and treated cautiously, not embraced as verified fact. That is why the phrase "never kidnapped" keeps surfacing around this case, even though it needs to be handled carefully. Strictly speaking, we do not know that. Publicly, investigators have not said that. If by kidnapped someone means taken against her will, then the evidence may still point in that direction. But if by kidnapped they mean a functioning ransom plot in which Nancy was alive, hidden, and being used as leverage over time, that is where the case looks less certain now than it did in the first week. CNN legal and law enforcement commentary made that distinction early, noting that an abduction and a ransom kidnapping are not always the same thing, and that motive is what separates them. And once you make that distinction, the expert comments start to line up in a more revealing way. Former FBI and CIA agent Tracy Walder said the crime appeared targeted, not random, and she raised the possibility that the selection of Nancy may have been connected to Savannah Guthrie's public profile. That does not prove motive, but it points the case away from a simple burglary or random opportunist. It points toward intention. It suggests the house, the woman, or the family may have mattered before that night ever began. Then there is John Miller's analysis. His view, quoted in later reporting, was that this may have begun as a planned home invasion that went completely sideways and was then re-engineered into a kidnapping for ransom story after the suspect's opportunities had changed. He also pointed directly to the blood outside the front door as the key denominator, suggesting that whatever the original crime was, it started going wrong very quickly. That is not a final answer, but it is a serious framework, and it explains why so many details in this case feel mismatched. Now bring the son-in-law's vehicle back into the picture. This detail has lingered because it refuses to fit neatly into the early public version of events. Reporting in late February and March indicated that a vehicle tied to Nancy's daughter Annie Guthrie and son-in-law Tommaso Tioni remained part of the investigation even after family members had been publicly cleared. Later reports suggested the vehicle may eventually have been returned. But the important point is that for a meaningful stretch of this investigation, law enforcement kept that vehicle in evidence while continuing to work the case. That does not prove wrongdoing by the family. It does not come close to proving that. But it does show that investigators did not treat the closed-in family timeline as settled beyond further testing. And that may be the clearest takeaway of all. The public wanted this case to become simpler over time. Instead, it has become more layered. The glove evidence looked promising, then failed to identify the suspect in CODIS, and later was tied to a restaurant employee who was cleared. The ransom trail created hope, then confusion. The new notes created fresh headlines, then more uncertainty. Savannah Guthrie returned to the Today Show on April 6th, but her return did not bring closure. It brought a painful reminder that her mother was still missing, the case was still open, and the original questions had not been answered. So the strongest conclusion available right now is not dramatic, but it is honest. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance still appears to involve force. It still appears to involve planning. It may still involve more than one person. But the classic image of a kidnapper keeping a hostage alive while waiting for ransom has weakened, not strengthened, under scrutiny. The blood at the house, the narrow overnight timeline, the lack of public proof of life, the strange media-facing message trail, and the continuing importance of evidence linked to Nancy's final family contact all point to a case that may have changed shape almost immediately. And that is the hardest part of the story. Not that there are no clues, there are many. Not that no one is working the case, they are. It is that the clues may be describing an event the public did not understand correctly at the beginning. A crime that was not random, not clean, and not necessarily what it first looked like from the outside. Savannah Guthrie and her family are still waiting. The reward has grown past $1 million. Authorities are still asking for tips. And after more than 2 months, one quiet truth now sits underneath every update. This case may not need a better ransom theory. It may need a different theory altogether. So here's the question I want to leave with you. Do you think the ransom messages were ever part of a real kidnapping, or were they sent to explain a crime that had already gone wrong? And if you want careful updates without the noise, subscribe and stay with me. Because in a case like this, the detail everyone skipped early is often the detail that matters most in the end.